Since everyone clicks go. Yes. Okay. Hi. It's Wednesday, 27th of October afternoon. Anthropology and the Human Condition is the course. This is lecture number 7. Ethics with a question mark. Okay. I see that I have the wrong course number for this. It's 302.113. I'd better change that. I'll do that very soon. Let me get into this though. So we're talking about ethics today in anthropology. Yeah, look, I put the ethics question mark, but in this one I haven't got the question mark, and that difference is not intentional. It should have had a question mark. Ethics in anthropology. So the critiques of colonial anthropology, we've examined some of them already in this course, pretty much had been neglected up until the 1960s and then became a very central issue. And it's not unrelated to the ethics question. And this has been my ongoing research project for a long time. Like, it's almost one that will never stop because it's always throwing up throughout my career. And I think throughout anyone's career, this question remains a kind of, well, open wound even. And they keep on coming. It keeps on, the new controversies keep on coming up about bias, neutrality, gender, trans, state involvement, corporate involvement in the anthropological project, the university as a business, all sorts of issues. And the rethinking of ethical codes in anthropology has become a thing. That's why I gave you the reading of the 2009 Code of Ethics, the American Anthropological Association, but I note that there's a 2011 version and, 2012 version, 2011 for the Association of Social Anthropology. It doesn't really matter which one you read because I want to read them all in a way as a topic of research, not just to somehow teach you ethics, because yeah, I'm not that wise, and who is, right? Anyway, in the format of these things, they're being guides, and the idea that there will be methods and procedures and guides and structure. I'll talk a little bit about the method of my research for this one. I don't think that every presentation has to, every anthropological, every academic, every scholarly presentation or paper has to always follow the rules. But there are rules, so let's at least pay them a bit of heed, some attention, and consider. So there's lots of things that I've looked at for this. So we can talk about methodology. I mean, basically, it's the usual stuff. I combine anecdotes and experience from having been an anthropologist for too many years, 30 plus years, and combine these things I picked up over time with textual evaluations I've made, reports I've read, articles that I collect, and now getting on to being far too many, and evaluating the historical debates and collective debates, collections about group debates. In fact, there was a series called Group Debates about anthropological engagement or ethical engagement, encounter with the world. I specifically studied particular controversies, and I've been careful to gather as much as I can on each of these, and to the point where now I feel like it's very difficult to even commit to print. There's too many things, and not all angles will be able to be summarized even. But things like the Tribal Research Centre in Thailand, which was an issue. When I was living in Sydney, there were big debates about that in the Sydney Anthropology Department. So that's why it became well, it was an issue, but it became particularly one that I was interested in because it was close. Similarly, I was close to some people who were working on the Counterinsurgency Marine Corps Handbook, COIN, Counterinsurgency, which was a military guidebook we'll spend a bit of time with in the second half today. But the military guidebook for the Iraq War. So when we were doing anti-war activism work in Britain, this was alongside some people that were publishing on exactly this issue. Nowadays, well, I've mentioned just last week, I think it was, Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture was recently translated into Tingviet. So, so that's of interest, but it's because it's accessible to you all, but also because we were talking exactly about World War II and anthropologists that put their work in the service of the war effort, in the war against fascism and Japanese national fascism. And well, Benedict actually was doing this after the war, but it was in the context of the ongoing war effort. And I'm not excusing or condemning. I will do some criticism, but it happened, so it's subject to evaluation. And new stuff that I've been exploring just the last 2 days, actually. Cora Du Bois, well, the last couple of weeks, but especially intensively the last couple of days. Cora Du Bois' work. There's a biography of hers about her, came out, written by Susan Seymour in 2015. So I've been reading that and finding out a lot about the Anthropological Association, American Anthropological Association, and its involvement in war research, and or even more, finding out more about that. And in that interest, being in Vietnam, I picked up the ethnographic study series contracted by the US Department of the Army in Vietnam in 1966. And I'm very interested in a big fat book that we'll look at a bit more closely, 1,162 pages of Department of Defense Anthropology. Department of Defense, that's the Australian. Department of the Army. Right, but basically the thing that this research is on, meta-research about anthropology in a way, it's about the guidelines that are given to students to teach them about ethics. All right, so I've been in lots of classes where this has happened, and I'm not saying that this is that class, because, well, I guess it is in a way. I don't think you can have a methods discussion that's not a critique of methods. Similarly, I don't think you can have an ethics guidelines discussion that's also not a critique of guidelines. Right? But you have to look at some of them to be able to discuss. So let's look. I'm going to take the UK Association of Social Anthropology guidelines and the USA American Anthropological Association ethical guidelines. There are others, the European Association, there are many others actually. And there are many other organizations that have guidelines. So it's perhaps important to recognize that. Though anthropology seemed to have got in quite early, right? 1948 for the Association of Social Anthropologists. Well, the Association for Applied Anthropology at the time, a subgroup, put out a guideline. But many professional groups, representative groups like associations, they're not exactly unions. They're more for professional levels. They're like unions, but they're not quite. They're professional associations representing a profession, and they are really a lobby group, often looking after the interests of their members, sure, but also trying to influence policies and involvement with governments in the interest of their members, but also in the interest of the disciplines or their subject area or their topic or institutional space that they are representative of, trying to influence things to their benefit. And some of these lobby groups produce guidelines, some are subject to guidelines, some are more commercial, some are more philanthropic, some are more disciplinary based or institutional, some are quite radical. You know, companies have to now submit to certain standards and follow certain guidelines. So they have to do environmental impact reports and things like that. And then there's a list of things that they have to perform, comply with. And there's debate about those things. So no surprise that in anthropology there's massive debate about the kind of statements that go into determining what should be best practice for producing knowledge in a discipline like anthropology or in a university. And that changes over time as well. And that's what's probably most interesting about it, is how and why it changes over time, why the guidelines are different now than they were 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Right? What's changed? Let's look a little bit quickly at, a bit too quickly at first, at some guidelines, just to see what kind of things we're talking about. The US American Anthropological Association basically has a set of guidelines, 2012, that follows 7 principles. Basically, there's a page on each of these principles, but very quickly they are the statement on ethics. 1, do no harm. That sounds a bit like I don't know, a slogan for a modern company, like, I don't know, Google, don't be evil. Right? Isn't that their slogan? I don't know whether it's their slogan or strapline or something. Do no harm. Be open and honest regarding your work. I mean, each of these can be debated. Open and honest regarding your work. Well, what does that really mean? Do no harm to who? I mean, knowledge, I don't know, we know Walter Benjamin always would say that every document of culture is a document of barbarism, and every work of art, Adorno says, it was an act of violence not committed. Do no harm. How do you judge this? And they, of course, they elaborate in a page. Right? 3, obtain informed consent and necessary positions. What would informed consent be? We can see there's a problem with that as well, because we are struggling ourselves to settle agreed definitions of what anthropology is and what it means and what the implications are. So how would someone who isn't steeped in studying anthropology for years and years be able to respond to someone who says, oh, hi, can I have your consent to do anthropology on you? What? Anthropology, not origami. Informed consent is, of course, much debated in many areas as well, not just for teenagers and sex. 4, weigh competing ethical obligations, due collaborators and affected parties. Weigh, well, this one's more interesting. Weigh, at least there's some evaluation recognized, and it's not as like an order. Obtain informed consent. Like, I don't think you can simply order that. There's too much debate to be had. But weigh competing ethical obligations, of course you can do that. You can look at the competing obligations and try and measure, weigh them. To weigh is more colloquial than measure. Let me see, try and assess which one is more important, which one is heavier, which one is of more gravitas. And that recognizes that there are competing interests or obligations, and they're due to collaborators and affected parties. There could be lots of different parties, and you might affect them in different ways. So to weigh them is better than to satisfy them or pay complete heed to. Make your results accessible. Again, that's an order word. Make your results accessible, but to who? In what language? At what level of abstraction? Or what level of detail? Do I have to show you my handwritten scribbled notes in my personal notebook, or do I have to make all of that, type it up and make it available publicly? Do I have to, if I was writing about the coup d'etat, Lévi-Strauss, right? He went to see the coup d'etat, and I write a book in French, do I have to then translate that, make it accessible to them because they don't speak French, right? I mean, it's not a, you can't just obey that one. This came up earlier today. As I was typing it out, my automatic spell check kicked in, and instead of typing protect, it guessed that I meant protest, probably because the algorithm is used to me writing about resistance and protests and so on. It's supposed to be protect and preserve your records. Don't throw your notebook away. But does that mean don't spill coffee on it and make it, don't let your kids put their paint on it or scribble with their crayons on it? That's not protecting your records. So they're all debatable things, but you're getting the idea of what kind of topics are in a guidelines list. 7, maintain respectful and ethical professional relationships. Yeah, there's so many things that can be as well. So I'm interested in this area. So I'm doing research about it, and it's some of it is incomplete as yet, and some of it is really new. For example, the stuff around Cora Du Bois, because it's only been 6 months or so that I became really interested in her, and especially over the last week, been reading a lot of detail in the last 2 days, primarily, reading her biography of her, 2015, and then I read some of her work on the ghost dance, but that's really quite old, but ghost dance is interesting. She was the president of the American Anthropological Association, which is why she's really relevant to this and interesting, because she was a president at a really interesting time when some revelations came out about anthropology, American anthropology in particular, to do with Vietnam. And I haven't sorted out these notes yet completely, but right, she was known to Louis Mountbatten, who was head of the Southeast Southeast Asia Command during the war, right? And she worked for him basically during World War. Well, she was in Indonesia doing field work just before World War II, and she. Well, let's go back further. She'd been taught by Boas and Ruth Benedict, right? Well, done a 1-year course, but then she moved to California to study with Kroeber, who was the father of Ursula Le Guin, the sci-fi writer, and she became interested in psychoanalysis, and she did some work on psychiatry and psychoanalysis, and then went to cross-cultural psychoanalysis, which is interesting, right? And then she went to Indonesia and was working there, and then World War II begins. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor for Americans. That's when it begins, in December 1941. And from there, first of all, she was the chief of the Indonesian research branch of the Office for Strategic Services. And that was a forerunner of the CIA, basically. It was the wartime, well, it split into two things. It was split into the CIA and the Office of Intelligence Research, which was what she joined as well. So she didn't go down the CIA route. And yet, both of these are intelligence organizations, and you know what all that implies. Cloak and dagger spy stuff and secrecy. During the war especially, everything in code, all hands to the pump. She very interestingly employed a number of people, other anthropologists like Mandelbaum and Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead's husband, who joined the war. She became then the Southeast Asia branch chief. After working in the Army's Southeast Asia Command, at the end of the war, she then worked for 5 years in Southeast Asia as the branch chief of the State Department's Office for Intelligence Research. So the parallel for the CIA in Secret Service stuff. More focused on research than, I don't know, Mission Impossible kind of things. The Mission Impossible too old a reference? I don't know. I haven't seen John Wick. I don't know if he's CIA, but who else? Bourne, is it? Bourne Principle, or that series of movies, that kind of stuff is CIA. Doing your research is everything. She was awarded, she got some awards for her participation. And from Thailand, she got an award for her contribution during the war to Thailand, and something else from the US. But she also, because she was a member of the American Anthropological Association from the mid-40s onwards, she also got investigated by the FBI. And J. Hoover, right, was paranoid about people who might have been influenced by communism, and right, she's working for the Office for the Office of Strategic Services for the CIA, and she might be a communist. Come on. Anyway, McCarthyite era type stuff. The FBI investigates her for 12 years. It's crazy. Though it's 1960, they kind of reckon she's okay. She gets elected to be president of the American Anthropological Association in 67. Vice president and president-elect, they have a kind of apprentice system once you get elected, and then president until 1970. And I'm still working out exactly what she was responsible there, but she did recommend to her successor, George Foster, who took over after her, that he appoint Margaret Mead to investigate Eric Wolf and the Thailand controversy, which was really problematic because at this stage, Margaret Mead was, elderly and on the conservative side, and happily, when her report came in, the membership of the AAA voted overwhelmingly to reject the report. Before that, Cora Du Bois had part of the reason why the investigation with the FBI went on for so long is that she was offered a job at Berkeley to take over from Kroeber, who was retiring. She was offered the head of department job in anthropology at Berkeley. But she said no to it because they were demanding that she take the oath of allegiance to, America. And she wouldn't, because freedom of intellectual inquiry, freedom of speech, which sits a bit uncomfortably with someone who worked for the Secret Service. And you could see that there's obviously been there is a change in her outlook. She's become a bit disillusioned with the Secret Service and now wants to go for openness. And in fact, when she joins, when she's in the AAA, she becomes increasingly critical of the US effort. And in 54, apparently, I haven't documented this properly yet, she advises the US against joining the Vietnam effort. Don't take over where France has got into trouble, but of course that was unsuccessful. And long after the controversy of 68 that I'll talk about soon, she said things like anthropological research should never be used as a cover for intelligence work. Now that was said later, that was said in the biography by Susan Seymour. But it sounds a little bit like retrospective insight, foresight, hindsight. Sorry, but it does indicate maybe, and surely she was the one to know whether anthropology was being used for intelligence work, because she was in charge of doing exactly that for the Office of Strategic Services. I mean, so this raises general questions, right? The question of knowledge in anthropology. What should anthropologists know about? What should they have guidelines in terms of what they should know about? Recognizing that knowledge is never just objective or neutral. I mean, I think that debate's been had and won. There's no position from which you don't have your own interests and biases and assumptions that shape the knowledge you produce. To the extent you're conscious of that is different. Right? Whether you're a researcher studying tourism and development, there are obviously different competing interests for that. So you can produce knowledge for whether it's shamanism and on the other side, health, the World Health Organization and so on. Mythology, on the other side, missionary. There are different competing interests, museums, owners of artifacts. There are, even something as innocent as an old trinket in a museum is, and who it was owned by is not neutral knowledge. It's knowledge that's invested with interests, and some people say, so there must be ethics, there must be guidelines, because knowledge will impact all workers, all audiences, bystanders, and the researchers themselves, and there needs to be ethics, because knowledge now will have different implications later. Knowledge that from long ago will have different implications now. And some things might have implications that we don't even know yet what they will be. Unforeseeable impacts. Like, how were the Malinowskis, Trobrianders to know at the time that in 3 generations' time their descendants would have to perform being Trobriand for tourist groups that come on in huge boats that back then didn't even exist, right? Okay, now where this becomes interesting is that the issue, one of the controversies, or a set of controversies, revolve around exactly the US Army use of anthropologists in Vietnam. Right? And it remains a kind of touchstone. And the case study that we could start with is George Condiminis', the book I showed you last week, just briefly. Condiminis' We Have Eaten the Forest. Now, it doesn't all start with this, but he does get invited to speak at the American Anthropological Association. And I'll read to you a little bit of this, and you'll see why. Right? So this volume is the first English edition. Alan Lane, translated by Adrienne Fouque. I've seen that name before. Hang on, Adrienne Fouque. No, not that one I thought. Anyway, so We Have Eaten the Forest, the story of a Montagnard village in the central highlands of Vietnam. It's Sa Luc, the Munga, okay? And forgive my pronunciation. So this came out in English in 1977. So sometime after the controversy in the AAA, which was right 68, basically, when Cora Du Bois was president. But he came and spoke in, I think, 1970. Kathleen Gough is the one that really initiates the controversy, although there'd been lots in the letter pages of what anthropology should be doing in relation to the Vietnam War. But Kathleen Gough sponsored a motion to condemn the war from the Anthropological Association, one of the first US professional associations to come out against the war, which is a big move from anthropologists and World War II, right? But then public opinion had been swayed by the 60s, especially by Tet Offensive. But this is interesting. in many ways, but I'll read it and you'll get a flavor of how Condiminis writes, but also what the issue is. Some 20 years separate the first French edition, 1957, from the present English translation of this Chronicle of Sarluk. Basically, it's a diary of him spending time with in the village and drinking a lot. It has appeared in Italian, German, and Russian. In those intervening years, between 57 and now, several attempts were made to bring out an English language version, but they came to nothing, except for one. The first, as it happens, which dates back to 1962. But the initiative is singular in that it was a pirated edition, ascribable to the United States Department of Commerce, which acted for political and military reasons rather than out of any deep scientific concern, and did so without consulting either me, the author, or the original French publisher, Mercure de France. Right? Why the cynicism or unintentional humor? With some cynicism or unintentional humor, the persons responsible for this infringement of international copyright laws. Right, so what happens basically is the United States Department of Commerce translates 95% of the book, not the whole book, and makes it available to US Secret Service and Special Forces soldiers working in the highlands of Vietnam as a kind of guide to relationships with the Highlanders, who they were trying to entice away from Viet Cong influence, right, and train to fight for democracy. Right, so this was illegally translated and copied by the military for use in Vietnam, and Condiminis was upset at that, but and this became a discussion point in the Anthropological Association. Anthropologists in war, you know, we've been over this ground a little bit. We already know that Evans Pritchard, for example, had been involved, and you know, Malinowski got involved in the fight against Bolshevism, especially because of his wife and so on. No, not a big deal, though it's interesting that these things happen. Now, of course, I've said nothing is exempt from political use of knowledge. So of course, Marines going to fight in the Highlands would look for any texts that they could that will help them understand the terrain. Just like a tourism company going to enter a new area will look at environmental audits or in heritage development. You do research to help your organization or the authorities, or sometimes you do research to help the people. I mean, there's the question: do the people help from the research, or do the companies that want to work with the people or exploit the people, etc.? It's a tense issue because having guidelines for professional use of knowledge implies that there's a right answer to how it should be used, but all knowledge is used. And yeah, you could be in favor of better work conditions, or you could be in favor of competitiveness in business. They're not necessarily the same thing. You could be in favor of education in general or vocational education in a university teaching program. They wouldn't be the same thing. So it's interesting that anthropologists felt after this controversy of finding that there was some involvement of anthropology behind the enemy lines, so to speak, in Vietnam, they felt the need to then set up some guidance, some rules. Well, they say guidance, but we really mean rules. As I said, the UK Association for Social Anthropology was the first And let's look at this in detail. The Association of Social Anthropology, 2011 is the last agreed set. They're having a working group right now to, well, study 2019 to reevaluate and update the list. But it's very similar to the US one. The first line in the ASA one is to avoid causing harm. It's not a point-by-point thing. It's more like paragraphs. So the ASA seeks to encourage anthropologists to think about the ethical implications of their work in a profound and continuous way. Think hard and long. An ethical approach most centrally avoids causing harm, and they put that in italics, to our subjects. Is it ethical to say our subjects? Right, but anyway, by what we do in the field or write about them, and ideally ensures a reciprocal exchange of benefits. Okay, so I write a book about the Trobriands, and the Trobrianders get what? We will see. This requires much more than ticking off a checklist of do's and don'ts. Risk assessment and dealing with uncertainties about consequences must be ongoing and relevant to often dynamic contexts. Right, so they do recognize in this one, more than the AAA one, that the situation is fluid. Basically, you're saying, you mean there's politics involved in knowledge? Oh no. And there's competing interests, and that you enter into a domain where it's hard to say what's really correct. So anyway, consideration must be which knowledge might cause harm. You have to ask yourself that, right? How does the information I'm collecting put anyone's life in jeopardy? If it does, how does it affect their future prospects? How does anyone determine how that will happen, actually? How do they know what appropriate uses of knowledge will be? Like, anthropological knowledge was used by Malinowski to make a certain way of doing field work, the standard way for English anthropologists, social anthropologists. And subsequently, Malinowski has been used as kind of branding for that style of anthropology, so that it's taught by English anthropologists, and students from all over the world go to study that style of anthropology rather than, I don't know, French anthropology, which doesn't have the same branding. The methods of collection that Malinowski is famous for became the brand. And you know, every generation of students since then has done it has changed a little bit in that English or British anthropology also went through a kind of visual anthropology thing in the 80s. It updated a little bit, but it still kept the Malinowski fieldwork style. It kind of imported that into visual anthropology as well, but it was more fly on the wall, verite cinema. Just turn the camera on, pretend you're turning the camera on and just letting what's happening happen in front of the camera. It was never like that. And Henley should know that, but well, he does know that. But anyway, yeah. So this use of knowledge is not. It's never just neutral. So when you're asking the question of harm, how do you know what harm is being imposed? When Malinowski defended that style of doing fieldwork, which of course he got from Gillen, did he know that for the next 100 years, postgraduate students will be forced to read that first chapter of his book? That's a kind of causing harm. Anyway, at least they recognize that there are competing duties and obligations, right? And there's a need to make explicit, this is exactly what they say, you need to make implicit or explicit choices between their own values and between the interests of different individuals and groups. Which different individuals you're going to have to choose. Common checklists are, and this is very similar to the AAA one, the American one, consent, informed consent, non-exploitation at the time and later, Care for animals. Care for animals, that's a kind of unusual one. That wasn't in the American Anthropological Association one, but what will that mean? We'll come back to this, or we'll get to it next. Citation and credit. The ownership of knowledge, that's a big issue, and you all know that I talk about plagiarism and respect for the people who do the work. Transparency and anonymity. You kind of can't have both. Transparency will mean that you can name who everyone is in the photo, in the work. Anonymity means you protect those individuals by not giving their name. So you have to make a choice there. That's interesting. There's some things are like orders, some are more open to choice. Results and funders' interests, the independence of these, and the question of government control, right? So if a funder is funding your research, do you leave out of the book something critical of them? Of course you should not. But how forcefully do you then make the critique? And a person who wants continued funding finds a rhetorical way of, well, we'll see. But the animals thing, okay, that's very interesting. The ASA says anthropologists must do everything in their power to ensure that the research does not harm the safety, psychological well-being or survival of the animals or species with which they work. We're not in the business of studying animals as such, although some anthropologists talk about the relationship between humans and the animals in their environment. You know, and well, we might think about the psychological well-being or survival of the species of animals, different, and that's a big issue, right? Extinction events happening in our lifetime more than any other so far on the planet. It's criminal even. So it's important that these kind of issues come up. But I mean, I think about whether animals are exploited. Right? Do they produce surplus value under like workers do under capitalism? Or are they tools? And if they're tools, you know, a whole set of questions about labor theory of value would come up. But there are definitely animal activists and animal rights campaigners. So it's right and good that anthropology should consider this, and it's a value choice. I mean, the stark one with the tiger I've got in the picture. Let's look at the pictures of the tiger. The Bengal tiger from my fieldwork area. Okay, it's involved in. It's used as a symbol in politics. But it's also the case that in the Sundarbans Delta, the big delta area on the east coast of India and part of Bangladesh, which is the vast wilderness, pretty much as it always was, area where tigers live. And there are some people there, but mostly people have been moved out to protect the forest areas of the tigers, to leave them in a pristine condition. I don't think they ever were that pristine because people always lived there, but tigers and people obviously have to find ways to get along if they're going to live in the same space. It wasn't the case in the Mekong Delta, for example, where there aren't now tigers there, but there was people and industrialization. The choice was to look after that space for people. In the Sundarbans, they looked after the space for tigers. People were forced out at gunpoint by the government. And there are those, Amitesh Mukhopadhyay and others, I've written on their work, Anu Jalais, who talk about the relationship between humans and tigers in the Sundarban, but also try to document that exodus of people from that space and question whether the World Wildlife Fund and its money that defends the forest for tigers is always doing the right thing of this pretty angry animal after all, also fantastic. Right? Not just a lol cat from Facebook, but certainly, well, do no harm. They certainly don't. They're potentially going to do harm to anyone they can get those teeth around. Look at that. But fantastic animals, and of course people use them in political slogans and so on. But their psychological well-being, I don't know about projecting a psychological well-being onto a tiger. What's the psychological? When is a tiger doing well? When they're eating a human or a deer or some farm animals that they've not had to track for days and days. Anyway, we could project onto them, but certainly extinction and species issues. Actually, there's a woman called Rebecca Cassidy that I want to put on the list of anthropologists you could choose to study. I might put Anu Gilles and Amitesh Mukhopadhyay on as well, because their works on the Sundarbans are very interesting. And there should be comparative work between the Sundarbans and tigers there and tigers in the Mekong and Vietnam. There are older works that mention tigers a lot, and they're not. What else did the guidelines say? The guidelines talk about photography. It's interesting to me because we've been talking about photography in the history of anthropology. So in the guideline, the ethical guidelines of the ASA, it says photography, both stills and film, is a very important tool of anthropological inquiry. Really? Filming should always be overt. In the case of large public events, it's likely that not everyone photographed filmed will have the chance to give verbal consent. What, you have to give consent before you take a photograph? Was Billy Hancock doing so when he was photographing here? When photographs are taken, consent sometimes might be sought after the event. Oh, retrospectively. How much after? I mean, this photo wasn't included in the book, so it wasn't necessary for Malinowski to go and find out if it was okay, even for Billy to be photographed. Although then it was dug out of the archive by Michael Young. And now does he have to get consent? Anyway, it might not always be possible to obtain formal consent, so long as practical steps to do so are at least taken. Well, you know, if we read, we will read later Ariella Azule's work on civil contract of photography, where she talks about the scene of the camera involving a number of different actors, the person taking the photograph, the people being photographed, the pro-filmic, and the people looking at the photograph later on, who all have a relationship, and therefore ethical issues come up in the kind of social contract that they have with each other. I mean, think of this, and we've gone over before, this scenario, that when we're looking at this photograph, and when I put the two photographs together and are saying things about it, do I have obligations to Michael Young, to Malinowski, to the Trobranders, to Billy Hancock? You know, there are all sorts of new questions about the way in which photography belongs or doesn't belong, is a part of the production of knowledge and the retrospective analysis of history that Ariella Azule is questioning about the contract in photography involving viewers raises interesting ethical, unending ethical questions, because in 100 years' time, will this photograph mean anything similar? You know, photographs date quite quickly, right? Photographs of you and your family and your parents, your grandparents, and then the great-grandparents are just photographs of the old. Or eventually they're, I don't know, there's a couple of generations livelihood in photographs, but I mean, photographs have only been around since not even 2 centuries yet. So we'll see what happens. What else does the ASA pick up on? It's an interesting new development in 2011 was to talk about the digital. Unforeseen uses of theoretical interests may arise. Unforeseen uses or theoretical interests may arise in the future and may need to be conveyed to participants, right? One of these is the digital, right? We now can reproduce this photograph everywhere and circulate it faster than ever before, and it's reaches saturation level that, I mean, it's even being shown to students in Vietnam in an anthropology course now, right now. and I'm just sitting at home pressing buttons. It's weird, and yet there are ethical implications to think of these. And these are related to copyright legislation, and it's almost like there are fashions in where the ethical should land and what it should take into account, because the dark underbelly of that is the copyright and digital storage and data mining and market research is the real-time space of corporations. The underbelly of that is also corporate espionage, and hacking and fake news, a whole lot of new areas of uncharted, well, seems like largely unethical activity, all this fake news. It really is surely unethical to fabricate news. And yet, I was just advising someone the other day, but what if you faked a character as a way of opening up a research avenue, right? Let me think, what was that? Suggesting that, oh yeah, well, one of my PhD students, Stephanie Minrak, her PhD project was to write a history of a German female electronic music genius, right? And it was like in popular culture studies, a study of this forgotten and excluded because of sexism, this woman who'd been excluded from the history of German electronic dance music. Only she didn't exist. It was a fake history, but it was used to raise critical questions about the exclusion of women, the manufacture of persona, anonymity in music, in electronic music. A whole series of issues were opened up by this method of faking a narrative. It's quite an interesting methodology, and it raises some really important ethical questions. Should you research fake news by putting fake news out there and seeing how people pick it up? Think of the Orson Welles radio play, War of the Worlds, using H.G. Wells' story. He does a radio play, puts it out, and people think it's real, and they freak out because just before World War II, they're expecting the enemy to come and invade America, but it turns out it's aliens, but they sort of believe it because 20% of Americans think they have been abducted by aliens after all, right? So they're already that way disposed. But Orson Welles had kind of done a huge psychological experiment on whether people would believe the radio if it told them something. Martians are coming. They were pretending to be doing a news report. It was just a play, but people did believe it. Anyway, what? These are the kind of things that the ASA guidelines include and might have to debate as they rewrite them for the 2019 working group started, and they should report soon if they haven't already. I searched, but I haven't seen any report, which will then be fed into classes on ethics, where the guidelines will be used for training future knowledge creators in anthropology. Is it enough to have a debate about ethics so that will provoke you to try and behave more ethically in the field, or should there be, I don't know, a regime of punishment of regulation, proper enforcement? What would be the sanctions? How could you even do it? And how would that fit with academic freedom, freedom of speech, and the competing interests? So to research this, I've been looking at controversies, right? I mean, one level I go into detail on the specifics of the ASA guidance and drill down even further. So they talk about field notes and how you got to make your field notes available and right, all that. But then I also look at the controversies. And the controversies are, I've mentioned a couple already, the Thailand Tribal Research Center, where some anthropologists went and did research without covert research. And there was some research on the suppression, well, encouraging the suppression of opium cultivation, basically getting Aka tribes people in the north of Thailand to grow lettuce instead of opium. Like, lettuce doesn't make anywhere near the money that opium did. What was at stake there? But other projects like Project Camelot, which was just before the American Association controversy, so it filled their newspaper. This was a plan for anthropologists to be used in South America to support America's interest. Project Camelot was to be like a program of using anthropology for the military. It didn't get off the ground. It got halted because it was so controversial. Although there were anthropologists that worked in South America involved in health experimentation on tribal groups, a whole issue around the measles being introduced to the Yanomami. Yeah. All right, but what we'll look at after the break is human terrain systems, and I've taken the camouflage cover a little bit. This was a report, basically a handbook written for the Marines, the US Marines, by some anthropologists to help them in their work in Iraq. And a recent controversy in Britain with a research council offering research money for people to study how young Asian, British Asian men become radicalized, right? Because that's what happens to Muslim youth, right? There wasn't any money to examine Christian radicalization. Well, there probably is, but anyway, it became a big issue. No, but okay. Let's go to Vietnam for this controversy. I've been promising to talk about this and haven't got to. In the late 1960s, there were lots of debates in the AAA newsletter about the values and principles of the association. And then in I think it was 1967, an advertisement appeared in the anthropology newsletter where the Navy wanted to hire an anthropologist to work in Vietnam on psychological operations. And well, it came out eventually that there were many anthropologists working in Vietnam for the army already, right? But this one was the one that was the trigger, and wrong metaphor. Well, the very correct metaphor. What provoked Kathleen Gough to put forward a motion, and others put forward a motion condemning the destruction of people by weapons of mass destruction, napalm and so on, in Vietnam. And while the chair of the AAA at the time, and I don't know whether the President Cora Du Bois agreed with this, but the chair said it wasn't appropriate, but it was pushed through and voted on by the membership, and the membership overwhelmingly condemned the use of anthropology in or use of these destructive weapons in Vietnam, and was the first association, the first professional association in the US to come out against the war. What a big difference from World War II, as I said. But it was because basically watching Americans get killed on TV every night, public opinion had come round against the war. And anthropologists were involved in teach-ins and sit-ins and protest movement, just like any other campus-based situation. So no surprise. Of course, then an ethics committee was set up, because that's what a professional association does. It was headed by Eric Wolf, but it was opposed by Margaret Mead. And anyway, they made a report and found that there were significant cases. And in fact, the report doesn't show exactly how much there was, but I do have a document that does. I mentioned it already. This thing. This is the book, Minority Groups in the Republic of Vietnam. It's part of the Ethnographic Studies series, and I'll read from this. This volume was prepared by the Cultural Information Analysis Center, CINIFAC, Center for Research in Social Systems, CRAS, of the American University. It is designed to be useful to military and other personnel who need a convenient compilation of basic facts about the social, economic, and political institutions and practices of minority groups in the Republic of Vietnam. All right. This is convenient, compact. It's 1,160 pages, 163 pages. So it's not that compact, but it was given to me by my friend Sally, but it's available in secondhand stores here in Vietnam. It's basically 23 chapters, not 53 of the different minorities, but one chapter per minority with 7 sections in each, that is compiled by some anthropologists working with secondary documents mostly, at the request of the Directorate of Special Operations and the Office of the Chief of Research and Development, Department of the Army, to gather from the existing ethnographies and anthropology of Vietnam, like Condiminis, a compendium of what's known about the minorities of Vietnam. Right? And they put this together by interviewing people at Fort Worth, and they took work by famous anthropologists. I mean, they're in the bibliography. They footnote them and everything, right? Hickey, Donald Hickey, Condiminis, what's his name? Jacques Donez, Potal, you can get in Tin Viet. They're all mentioned there. And, well, it's kind of incredible what they say about each group. I'll have to give you a bit of a flavor of it by reading out some. Let's take, because I know someone, I've just been reading about their work, the Raglai. All right. Well, we could take the Hmong. No, the Raglai. Okay. Where's the page numbers seem to be not right? Did I read it wrong? 573, I did read it wrong. Okay, here we go. So this is where they live. You can see a little map. What's great about these things, we get maps and we get drawings of where they put their paddy and their pigs and so on. We will get pictures of their huts. Let me make sure that I'm getting this nicely framed. Yeah. Lovely line drawings that and there's drawings of their weapons as well, which is fantastic. So the Raglai live inland from the coastal cities of Nha Trang and Phan Rang in the Republic of Vietnam. They speak Malayo-Polynesian language related to that of the Jarai and the Rada. All right, name of the size of the group, location, temperatures, all sorts of physical. Then ethnic and racial background, something about how they count, their numbers, some basic lingo that you can learn, some mythology, legendary history, settlement patterns, and then individual characteristics. Then they talk about structure, how they're matrilineal, right? That's really important. Everything's transmitted through the female line. Still an issue today, right? And men hunt and fish, clear and burn forest, and women do child rearing, care for the children, carry water, etc. And goes on, and as expected, right? And kind of interesting and so on, until we get to custom and taboo. So that's written in a style like, if you're visiting them, you need to know about this stuff. Don't enter a house unless you're invited, and things like that. What happens with visitors, what their view is to outsiders, if they're offended by a visitor who violates a taboo, they become openly hostile. They don't see many travelers because the mountains are difficult. Then something about missionary contact, economic organization, and then it gets interesting. Political organization, like the other Montagnard groups of the Republic of Vietnam, the Raglai lack an overall tribal political organization, blah, 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 blah. No, there's no central form of authority. They've been subject to the legal system instituted by the French and the Diem regime. And then it gets kind of outrageous, sort of thing that you wouldn't find in most anthropology. Subversive influences. Their isolation and marginal subsistence make the Raglai susceptible to Viet Cong subversive activities. Heavy Viet Cong infiltration in 1965 reportedly resulted in the flight of some tribesmen to resettlement areas near the coast. The primary objective of the subversive elements is to win the allegiance of the Raglai and to turn the tribesmen into active, hostile force against the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Generally, the Viet Cong infiltrate a village and work to win the confidence of either the whole village or its key individuals. They're so tricky, aren't they? They work with key individuals. Right? When propaganda and cajolery are not effective, the Viet Cong resort to extortion and terror, which usually results in passive resistance to the government or active support for the Viet Cong. Then communication techniques, civic actions, things to consider, paramilitary capabilities. Given the incentive and motivation provided with the necessary training, leadership and support, the Raglai can become an effective fighting force against the Viet Cong. Right? They've just been criticizing the Viet Cong for trying to recruit them, and now they're going to try and recruit them. With intensive training and support, the Raglai can be organized to defend their villages against the Viet Cong. With good leadership, they can be organized into an effective counter-guerrilla combat unit. Now this you would never find. I'm not saying the army is wrong to do this. I mean, this is what armies do, right? But it's really wrong for anthropologists. Ethically, it's problematic. Weapons utilized by the tribe. Their traditional weapons were crossbows, spears, and knives. An early account reported that the Raglai tipped their arrows and spears with virulent poison attained by the upas tree. The strong preparation of this poison apparently caused death within minutes. How to work with them. Basically, it says be polite, don't go in their houses, don't sleep with their women, and so on. And then their footnotes. They're to Henri Metry, Les Jungles Moi, Jacques Dornez, this guy, two of his books, Mr. Darby, Dambo, Win Van Huynh, and Dowdy, and Gerald Hickey, the anthropologist who worked for Rand Corporation. And each chapter is something like that. Each chapter has those sections. It's kind of general and so on, and then goes into how can we recruit these people for the war effort. And it says weird things about what the Viet Cong will do because they're so sneaky. Like that's the highlight of the book. Actually, is it how it portrays this the enemy, and the good practice suggestions, like don't have sexual relations with the women of the village, and provide some jobs, offer them money for small jobs, and respect. This has all been written about, of course. This book is still written about favorably by anthropologists, and some of them critical of using anthropology in the war effort. But others, David Price, for example, he wrote a book called Cold War Anthropology that's really important. But others like Colin Mackerras, in 2003 in his book Ethnicity in Asia, said that this book is still recommended reading for anyone who wants to know about minority groups in the Republic of Vietnam. And there's so much been written since by Vietnamese that it's sort of astonishing. The book Minority Groups in the Republic of Vietnam, this provides the available literature, a summary of the available literature on all the northern and southern minority groups, according to another recent author. Actually, an author called Rambo. Not the same Rambo as the Hollywood version, but yeah, weird. So according to Schrocken, or the Viet Cong themselves, then they'd be filing their teeth to fit in with the tribal manner. They even sometimes married into tribal groups, and they snuck them back to Hanoi for training and so on, as if this kind of thing is dastardly. And what the Americans were trying to do with this book, which is recruit the Raglai to defend their villages for democracy, was any different. And there are lots of other studies of minority groups in Vietnam, of course, and it goes back to a 20-year project to document the minority groups. After Ho Chi Minh himself had said, living in the mountains in the north, being supported by hill tribe people as they were forced out of Hanoi after 45. So how many minority groups are there? What do we know? And no one could answer him. So they set up a project which worked for 20 years, comes up with the 53 minorities. Just recently, the National Assembly, 2019, put out a new report about the status of the programs to support the different minorities and the need to recognize various issues like their matrilineal kinship system for the Raglai, for example. Women are moving outside for employment because they're breadwinners. Men are not, because they have to look after drinking rituals, or they're not motivated. There are other studies as well, or other examples. The museum here in Ho Chi Minh City, the History Museum, just redesigned a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the a whole wing of its museum to acknowledge the music or the material culture of the 53 minorities. Well, not all of them are represented there, but it's not such a big space. But it's a really excellent exhibition, should be checked out. And there are other studies. Crikey, what else? There's Kathleen Gough. Eventually, she did come to Vietnam to check it out, and she produced a book called. She was a guest of Vietnam in 1975, and she came back and wrote a book, 10 Times More Beautiful: The Rebuilding of Vietnam, which is actually a diary of her few weeks visit. Of course, she was taken to places to see projects and so on, but it's actually really quite a good read. Cora Du Bois' biography, of course, is interesting, as is, more problematically, May Elliott's novel, The Sacred Willow, a story of 4 generations of a family, because May Elliott worked for Rand Corporation, right? And they were the front for anthropologists doing this kind of work. And Donald Hickey. May Elliott's book on the Rand Corporation, the history of the Rand Corporation, is available from the Rand Corporation website. So I just tracked that down last night. I haven't read it yet, but I'm not anticipating it being, after having read The Sacred Willow, I don't anticipate May Elliott's Rand Corporation volume to be that critical of Rand, because it's on their website. Donald Hickey worked for Rand as well as an anthropologist, and he's written a book, the name of which, frankly, I forget, but it was on this link, the Washington Post. Yeah, here it is. It's called Window on a War, an Anthropologist in the Vietnam Conflict, by Gerald Hickey. And there are 2 of his other books look pretty interesting. Village in Vietnam, 1964, very early one. And Sons of the Mountains in 1982, about the Highlanders. So again, so many interesting things on this topic for the research project. So it's never going to end, I'm afraid. I think I need to stop for a bit and make a coffee, give you a break. When we come back, I will talk about the counterinsurgency handbook. We'll have discussion and chat about the assessment. You can put questions. Well, you've got the questions to answer, and that'll raise some things for discussion in the questionnaire on e-learning. There's the chat here, email, and of course you can talk it up. So let's take just a few minutes, 14:02 now until 2:10, so you can fill out the questionnaire as well. And we'll get back to look at counterinsurgency, COIN for short. And I wish I had the book here, because you've got to feel the texture of it. It's in camouflage, right? Although because it's for Iraq 2006, it's the wrong kind of camouflage. Right? It's not brown and yellow and silvery grey or whatever, the new camouflage. This is Vietnam era camouflage, and America's not fighting that war anymore. Well, it's refighting it in Hollywood, but it will do that forever. All right, 10:00. We'll come back and leave your questions on the chat, and I'll be back earlier than that, but well, that will do for this part anyway. Thank you.